They found her behind the saloon, face bloodied, clutching a torn shawl. The men who'd done it were already laughing their way down the street, her husband among them. "Ain't no use for a woman who can't give me a son," he'd said before walking away. Folks watched, but no one helped. No one except the rancher. A man known for keeping to himself, eyes cold from years of silence. He stepped through the crowd, lifted her to her feet, and said in a voice that left no room for argument, "You're coming with me." The town whispered that night, wondering what business a lonely rancher had with a broken woman, not knowing that both their lives were about to change forever. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The rain came down hard as Eli rode through the heart of town, the downpour hammering against his hat brim and soaking through his coat. But he didn't slow, didn't look left or right, didn't so much as flinch beneath the 100 eyes that followed him from porches and doorways and half-drawn curtains. The woman in his arms, Mara, though he didn't know her name yet, hung limp against his chest, her breath shallow, her shawl little more than a tattered rag clinging to her shoulders. Blood and rain streaked her face until the two were indistinguishable, washed into the mud that trailed from her hair to the hem of his saddle blanket. The horse shifted beneath them, uneasy with the weight and the whispers, but Eli pressed a steadying hand against its neck. He could feel the town's judgment burning into his back like coals, old men muttering behind cracked teeth, women clutching their shawls, even the sheriff watching from the steps of the jailhouse with that familiar look of cowardice disguised as law. Eli's jaw tightened, the muscle twitching beneath his stubble. These same folks who now gawked in silence had stood not 30 minutes ago watching her beaten half to death behind the saloon, too scared or too cruel to lift a hand. He had been no better once, years ago, when he'd learned it was easier to look away than to care, but something about the sight of her crumpled in the mud. Her husband laughing with his friends as if she were a thing discarded, had snapped that numbness clean in two. He guided the horse past the last of the lamplight, the street fading into open land where the prairie stretched wide and lonely. The sound of rain softened against the rhythm of hooves, the world shrinking to the beat of the horse's heart and the ragged rasp of the woman's breath. For a long time, neither of them spoke. She stirred once, just enough to clutch at his coat, her fingers trembling against the fabric. When she finally found her voice, it came out, small, broken, carried more by will than strength. "Why?" she whispered, barely audible over the rain. For a moment he thought she meant something else, why her husband had done it, why no one had stopped him, but when he glanced down and met her bruised, hollow eyes, he knew what she was really asking. "Why me? Why now? Why did you care?" His throat felt raw, the words clawing their way up before he could stop them. "Because someone had to," he said simply, the answer flat and final but softened by something he hadn't felt in years, mercy. She blinked, a tear lost to the rain, and let her head fall back against his chest, her body going still again. Eli didn't know where he was taking her, not really. Home, he supposed, though that word hadn't meant much since the fire that took his wife and child. The ranch was miles away, far beyond the reach of gossip or decency, and he'd spent years keeping it that way. But tonight, the silence there would have company, and somehow that thought didn't unsettle him as much as it should have. The road stretched before them in a slick ribbon of mud and moonlight, the wind carrying the scent of sage and wet earth, and for the first time in a long while, Eli Rawson felt something stir beneath the scar tissue of his heart. It wasn't pity. It wasn't even anger. It was something quieter, heavier, an understanding that this broken, bloodied woman had been thrown away by the same world that had forgotten him, and that maybe, just maybe, they both deserved a chance to see what was left after the storm. By the time Eli's horse reached the ranch, the storm had dwindled to a cold drizzle, the kind that clung to skin like sorrow and soaked straight through to bone. The land stretched empty around them, a lonely sprawl of grass and mesquite where the world seemed to stop listening, and his house stood at its center like something left behind by time itself. Gray wood, bowed by years of wind. The porch, half collapsed. The chimney coughing smoke as if the fire inside could barely remember how to burn. He dismounted slowly, every movement deliberate, his body weary not from the ride but from the weight of what he'd done. He wasn't a man used to bringing anyone home. Even the neighbors, if they could still be called, that kept their distance, whispering that Eli Rawson preferred ghosts to people. Maybe they were right. But as he lifted Mara down, her frame light as a shadow in his arms, he knew he'd made the right kind of mistake. Inside, the air smelled of ash, leather, and disuse. A single plate sat by the stove, a cup beside it, both washed and waiting, though no one had touched them in days. The table bore the faint scars of years' knife marks, scorch stains, and the worn spot where one elbow had rested night after night. Beside the hearth, one chair leaned against the wall, its seat worn thin, its mate long gone to rot. It was a house stripped of laughter, stripped of everything except the bare necessities of a man who'd long ago stopped expecting company. Eli set her down gently on the couch, his silence heavier than the rain outside. She looked around, taking in the emptiness, the solitude stitched into every corner, and something inside her ached, not for herself, but for him. "You live alone?" she asked quietly, her voice rasping like dry reeds. He nodded once. "Always have, mostly." It wasn't true, but the truth wasn't something he owed her, not yet. He lit a lamp, its weak glow flickering across the walls, then poured her a tin cup of water and pushed it toward her. "Drink, then rest." She hesitated, as if waiting for cruelty disguised as kindness. But when none came, her trembling fingers closed around the cup. "I can't pay you," she whispered after a moment, shame bleeding into her words. "Didn't ask you to." His tone was rough, but there was no edge in it, only exhaustion and a kind of weary decency that made her chest tighten. He turned away then, muttering something about feeding the horse, leaving her to the quiet warmth of the fire. The room felt foreign and safe all at once, the creak of the floorboards like a heartbeat, steady and grounding. When he returned, he set a plate of stew before her, simple, hearty, steam curling up like an offering. "Eat," was all he said, and when she tried to thank him, he waved it off, retreating to the far side of the room as if afraid of being seen. That night, after he'd shown her to the small spare room, dusty but clean, with sheets that smelled faintly of cedar, Mara lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint murmur of wind against the windows. She had known hunger, cruelty, and the sting of betrayal. But never this quiet, this space carved from gentleness rather than pity. And for the first time in years, her tears came not from pain or fear, but from the bewildering kindness of a man who asked for nothing and gave more than she'd ever been offered. Outside, Eli sat by the dying fire, his gaze fixed on the door to her room, wondering why the sound of another person breathing under his roof made the house feel less haunted than before. The days passed like dust devils across the prairie, slow, circling, unhurried but never still. And though time at Eli Rawson's ranch had a way of stretching thin and quiet, it began, almost imperceptibly, to fill again. The woman he'd carried from town, who had first lain pale and hollow-eyed on his couch, began to move through the house like a spirit returning to flesh. Mara's bruises faded to faint shadows. Her lips no longer trembled when she spoke, and sometimes, when she thought he wasn't watching, he caught her humming to herself by the stove, soft and wavering, like a melody from another life. Eli never asked about the man who had done it. He didn't need to. The truth of it hung around her like a second skin, the kind of suffering that didn't need words to explain. Still, one evening, when the fire burned low and the night wind rattled the windows, she spoke on her own. He had been mending tack by the hearth, the faint scrape of his knife against leather keeping rhythm with the clock on the mantel, when she said, almost absently, "I had 3 daughters." The knife stopped mid-cut. He looked up slowly, unsure whether she'd meant to speak aloud. Her eyes were fixed on the flames, their reflection dancing in the wet gleam of her tears. 3, she repeated, voice thin as wind through broken glass. Clara, Ruth, and little May. The oldest would be near 12 now. May had curls like... She stopped, pressing her lips together as if holding the rest in might somehow keep them close. Eli said nothing for a long while, afraid that if he spoke, the moment would shatter. When he finally did, his voice was low, rough-edged. "Where are they now?" The question hung heavy, uninvited but necessary. Mara's hands twisted in her lap, knuckles white. "Gone," she said finally. After the second, after she swallowed hard. His people took them. Said a woman like me had no right to raise them. Said I wasn't fit. I begged. They didn't even let me say goodbye. Her words cracked, the sound small and breaking, like brittle branches underfoot. Eli's throat worked as he tried to find something to offer comfort, maybe, or promise, but the truth was, he didn't know how to speak to that kind of loss. He only knew the silence that came after it. "You don't know where they are?" he asked quietly. She shook her head, her gaze far away now. "Somewhere back east, maybe. Somewhere they can forget me." The last words came out on a breath that wasn't quite a sob, but close. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking clock and the faint hiss of sap in the fire. Eli set his knife aside and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Don't seem right," he muttered. "Ain't no man's place to take what's not his." Mara smiled faintly at that sad but genuine. Right and wrong don't mean much when the world's watching a man beat his wife and still tips their hat to him come Sunday. Eli met her eyes across the firelight, and in them he saw a strength that startled him, a will that had survived hell and still held steady. "You got a fight left in you," he said quietly. "That counts for something." She looked away, wiping her eyes with the corner of her shawl. "Fight don't bring back what's lost." "Maybe not," he said, voice low. "But it's what keeps you alive long enough to find what can be." Neither spoke again that night. But when Eli went to bank the fire before bed, he noticed she'd left her chair closer to his than usual, and that, somehow, made the silence feel less like loneliness and more like healing. The night was heavy with the smell of rain again, thunder rolling far off like a memory refusing to fade, and Eli sat by the fire with his usual stillness, the orange glow tracing the hard planes of his face while the wind worried the edges of the shutters. Mara sat across from him, her mending forgotten in her lap, her fingers brushing thread that had long gone slack. They had fallen into a rhythm these past weeks, quiet suppers, long silences that somehow no longer felt empty, the comfortable distance of two souls too wounded to demand more of each other than company. Yet something in the way he stared into the fire that night, jaw set, eyes hollowed by thought, tugged at her. His silence, once a mercy, now felt like a wall, and she found herself wanting to know what lived behind it. "Eli," she said softly, her voice barely rising above the hiss of the logs. "Why did you help me that night?" He didn't answer at first. The flames crackled, a piece of wood collapsed inward, and he reached out absently to steady the poker. For a long time she thought he might ignore the question altogether, the way he had sidestepped so many before. But then he sighed, the sound deep and rough, as though drawn from somewhere far older than his years. "Didn't plan on it," he said finally. "Was just coming back from town with feed. Saw you there, on the ground, and it was like seeing a ghost." His voice faltered. "Couldn't walk past, not again." Mara frowned. "Again?" His gaze stayed on the fire, as if it might judge him less than she could. "My wife," he said quietly. Her name was June. She was the kind of woman who made you think the world might have got one thing right. He paused, swallowing hard. "We had a boy, too. Samuel. Smart as a whip. Could ride before he could walk. Near enough. But the fever took him. One night he was laughing, the next he was gone. And June..." He broke off, the word catching like a splinter in his throat. "June weren't the same after. I tried to fix it, to keep the ranch running, to keep her breathing. But I didn't know how to mend what grief breaks. One morning, she just didn't wake up. Doctor said her heart gave out. I reckon it was broken long before that." The words came slow, measured, as though each one cost him blood to speak. Mara sat frozen, her throat thick, the ache in his voice reaching some buried part of her that still remembered what it was to lose everything that mattered. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He gave a slight nod, eyes still fixed on the flames. "I failed him," he said, more to himself than to her. "Didn't see what was slipping away until it was gone. When I found you that night, beaten and left in the dirt, I saw her in you, June, the way she used to look at me when she still hoped I'd do something right." The room seemed to shrink with the weight of it, the fire casting shadows that reached across the walls like ghosts drawn near to listen. Maybe, he said finally, voice trembling in a way that startled her. Maybe I just figured I could do one thing right before I die. Mara's eyes stung, but she said nothing. She only watched him, saw the way his hand trembled as he reached for his coffee, saw the hollowness that years of guilt had carved into him. And in that moment she understood that his silence wasn't born from indifference, it was armor, built plank by plank around a grief too heavy to name. The fire crackled again, softer now, the storm easing beyond the walls, and as they sat together in the flickering half-light, she realized that two broken hearts could sometimes find a strange kind of peace simply by surviving in the same quiet. The morning they came was clear and sharp, the kind of morning where the air smells like dust and distance, the sky a hard blue that gives no mercy. Eli had been out by the corral fixing a loose rail, the sun barely cresting the horizon, when he saw them riding up from the east, their figures small at first, just shapes against the light, but he knew the cut of their shoulders and the swagger of their stride long before they drew close enough for faces. He didn't need to ask who they were. The one at the front rode like a man who believed the world owed him obedience, his hat tipped low, his grin all venom. Mara's husband. Behind him came three others, ranch hands from town, men whose courage grew only when bolstered by company and whiskey. Eli didn't move, didn't reach for the rifle leaning by the fence post, didn't even wipe the sweat from his brow. He just straightened, quiet and steady, and waited as the riders slowed to a stop before him, the dust curling around their boots like smoke. "Rawson," the husband called, his voice sharp and smug. "Heard you've got something of mine." Eli's jaw flexed. "Ain't got nothing that belongs to you." The man laughed, the sound dry and cruel. "That's so, 'cause my wife's been seen hanging around your place. Pretty thing, when she ain't crying. You got a taste for another man's leavin's?" The others chuckled behind him, spitting tobacco into the dirt. Inside the house, Mara froze where she'd been kneading bread, her hands slick with dough. She could hear every word through the thin boards of the wall, and her heart thudded like a hammer against her ribs. For a moment she considered running back to the small room, out the back door, anywhere, but then she remembered Eli's words from nights past, steady and certain. "You're safe here." She stood still, trembling, but she didn't hide. Eli took a slow step forward, his boots grinding into the gravel. "She ain't yours anymore," he said, voice low but cutting through the air like a blade. "You lost the right to call her that the first time you raised your hand." The husband's smile faltered, just a flicker, then hardened again. "You think taking her makes her clean? You think the law's gonna side with a man who's harboring another man's wife?" Eli's eyes were cold as steel. "I ain't harboring no one. I'm protecting her." The two men stared at each other, the world holding its breath between them. The horses shifted, tails swishing, uneasy under the tension that thickened like heat. For a heartbeat, Mara thought blood would spill right there in the dust, but Eli didn't reach for his gun, and the husband didn't draw. The rancher's calm, the sheer weight of it, was enough to make the others uneasy. Eli took another step closer, his voice dropping lower still. "You got what you came for your answer. Now ride." The husband's mouth twisted, and he spat into the dirt near Eli's boots. "You're a dead man, Rawson," he hissed. "Next time I come, I'll bring the law." "You do that," Eli said, his gaze unflinching. "Bring whoever you want. Just don't bring hope of leaving with her." For a long moment no one moved. Then the husband jerked his reins, turning his horse sharply. The men followed, their laughter forced now, hollow. Eli watched until they were nothing but specks against the horizon, his shoulders still, his hands steady. Only when the last echo of hooves had faded did he turn toward the house. Mara stood in the doorway, pale and shaken, her eyes searching his face. "He'll come back," she whispered. Eli nodded. "I know. He'll bring the law." "Then the law'll have to see the truth," he said quietly, and for a heartbeat the silence between them was louder than the wind. Outside, the dust settled, and the prairie held its breath, waiting for the reckoning that everyone knew was coming. Winter came early that year, sliding down from the mountains like a whisper of ice and shadow, coating the world in frost that creaked beneath boots and silenced the land for miles. The sky turned pale and endless, the air so cold it stung the lungs. But somehow, inside Eli Rawson's ranch house, warmth began to return not from the fire alone, but from the woman who had once been little more than a broken shadow in his doorway. Mara moved through the rooms now with purpose, her limp nearly gone, her hair no longer hanging limp around her shoulders but tied back with a strip of faded ribbon she'd found in one of Eli's old trunks. She mended the curtains, patched his worn shirts, polished the few dishes he owned until they gleamed faintly in the lamplight. In the mornings, before dawn, she rose first to stoke the fire and brew coffee, her humming soft beneath the wind's howl. Eli, a man used to silence and empty days, found himself listening for that sound each morning before he opened his eyes. She began feeding the stock with him too, trudging through snow in his oversized coat, her cheeks flushed with cold and determination. At first he'd told her not to bother, that she didn't owe him work for kindness, but she'd only smiled that small, steady smile of hers and said, "It helps me remember I'm alive." So he let her, though every time she lifted a bale or leaned too close to the horse's hooves, he caught himself watching with a strange, unfamiliar concern. The barn, once a tomb of dust and quiet, now echoed with life again, the creak of wood, the rustle of hay, the sound of her laughter when one of the colts nuzzled her hair. That laughter startled him the first time he heard it. It was light, unguarded, a sound that belonged to someone untouched by cruelty, and yet here she was, rediscovering it piece by piece. It stirred something in him he thought long dead. Slowly, the distance between them began to shrink, not with grand gestures but with the quiet persistence of shared living. Two mugs left drying side by side, two sets of footprints in the snow, two hands working the same piece of worn leather in the firelight. She teased him when he burned the biscuits, and he grumbled when she beat him at cards, though the corners of his mouth always twitched upward despite himself. Then came the morning when the frost lay thick across the pasture, the world painted silver under the rising Sunday. Eli had gone out early to break the ice in the troughs, his breath rising in pale clouds, when he slipped on the frozen boards and landed hard in the drift. The sound of Mara's laugh rang out from the barn door before he could even curse, bright and unrestrained. "You all right, cowboy?" she called, amusement softening the edge of the words. He scowled at her at first, brushing snow from his coat, but when he looked up and saw her smiling, really smiling, her eyes shining against the morning light, something cracked open in him. He laughed. A deep, rough, unexpected sound that startled even himself, rolling out across the field like thunder. The horses lifted their heads at once, ears pricking, as if unsure what to make of it. Mara's laughter joined his, echoing through the crisp air until the cold seemed to loosen its hold on the land. For a long moment they stood there, breathless and grinning, and Eli realized how long it had been since he'd felt something as simple, as sacred, as joy. Later, when they returned inside and she set a mug of coffee in his hands, her fingers brushed his, and for once, he didn't pull away. Outside, the snow kept falling, quiet and relentless, but within those walls, the thaw had already begun. The preacher came just after dawn, his arrival cutting through the stillness of the frozen morning like a bell in a graveyard. His horse was gaunt from travel, its sides heaving steam into the air, and his coat was thick with frost when he reined up before the porch. Eli had seen riders come and go from a distance before, most of them with bad news or worse intentions. But this man carried something else in his weary eyes, purpose, maybe, or pity. He dismounted slow, wincing as his boots hit the hard ground, and when he spoke, his voice carried the rough kindness of someone who'd seen too much of both heaven and hell. "Morning, sir," he greeted, tipping his hat. "Name's Reverend Carter. Passed through town and heard tell there was a woman staying here, Mara, I believe." Eli's hand tightened on the gate. "Who's asking?" "A friend of the mission down south," the preacher said, reaching into his coat. "Been carrying a letter meant for her. Took some time to find the right place." By then, Mara had come to the doorway, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, eyes wary but curious. The Reverend's face softened when he saw her. "Ma'am," he said, holding out an envelope weathered by the road, its seal cracked but still holding faint traces of ink. "This is for you. Came through the mission school at Copper Ridge." Her name was scrawled across the front in a child's uneven hand, Mama. The sight of it hit her like a physical blow. Her fingers trembled as she took the letter, staring at it as though afraid it might vanish if she blinked. Eli stepped closer, saying nothing, the weight of her silence louder than any words. She tore it open carefully, eyes moving over the faded writing, her lips parting as she read. Her breath hitched once, then again. "They're alive," she whispered, her voice breaking into something between a sob and a laugh. "My girls, Clara, Ruth, and May, they're alive. They're at a mission, school 2 towns south." The paper shook in her hands as the tears came, hot and unstoppable, her shoulders trembling under the force of them. Eli's chest tightened as he watched her, a strange mixture of relief and ache swelling inside him. "That's good," he said quietly, though the words felt too small. "That's real good." But she didn't smile, at least not yet. Instead, she folded the letter close to her chest and shook her head, fear shadowing the joy in her eyes. "They won't know me," she said softly. "It's been years. They'll think I'm dead. And if they don't, if they remember, they'll hate me for not coming sooner." Eli stepped forward, his voice steady and low, the kind of tone that brooked no argument but carried more care than command. "You don't know that," he said. "You ain't got reason to think the worst." "You don't understand," she whispered. "I lost them once. I couldn't bear losing them again." He studied her for a long moment, the firelight from the house flickering across his weathered face, and then he said, with a certainty that made the cold around them seem to retreat, "A mother belongs with her young." The words hung there, heavy and simple, like scripture. She looked up at him, tears still on her cheeks, and saw something in his eyes that startled her, a conviction that wasn't about obligation, but belief. Belief in her, in what she'd endured, in what she deserved. "We'll go," he said firmly. "I'll see to the horses. We can leave by first light." Mara clutched the letter tighter, her fear still a living thing but softened now by the steadiness in his voice. "What if they don't want me?" she asked one last time, barely more than a whisper. Eli's mouth twitched, the faintest hint of a smile ghosting there. "Then they'll have to learn what fools they are," he said. "But I don't reckon that'll be the case." And as the preacher rode away, leaving only hoofprints and the faint echo of his hymn behind, Mara stood with the letter pressed to her heart, the rancher's promise still ringing in her ears like the first real warmth of spring breaking through the cold. The road to Copper Ridge was long and silent, stretching across miles of hard prairie and brittle grass that whispered under the wind. They rode for 2 days with only the sound of hooves and the creak of saddle leather between them, the letter tucked safely in Mara's pocket like a fragile heartbeat. She barely slept, barely ate, her mind turning in endless circles of hope and fear. What if her girls had forgotten her? What if they hated her? What if the years had stolen more than time? Eli didn't press her to talk. He just rode beside her, steady and unyielding, a silent wall between her and the ghosts trailing behind. By the afternoon of the 3rd day, the mission came into view, a squat white chapel flanked by a row of modest buildings, its bell tower leaning slightly as though time itself had grown tired. The air smelled of wood smoke and wildflowers, and somewhere nearby, children's laughter carried faintly on the breeze. Mara dismounted slowly, her legs trembling, her hands clutching the worn leather of the saddle as if to anchor herself. Eli stayed back, letting her take the lead, his hat pulled low to shield the storm of emotion in his eyes. A kind-faced woman in a gray dress stepped out from one of the doorways, her expression cautious but kind. "Can I help you, ma'am?" she asked. Mara's lips parted, her voice trembling as she said, "I'm looking for my daughters, Clara, Ruth, and May Collins. I got a letter." The woman's eyes widened, softening with understanding. "You must be their mother," she said. "They're in the garden out back." For a moment, Mara couldn't move. Her feet felt rooted to the earth, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might give out. Then she nodded once and walked around the side of the chapel, her fingers clutching the edge of her shawl like a lifeline. The garden was small and sunlit, rows of cabbages and wildflowers growing in neat lines, and 3 girls worked among them. The oldest, maybe 15, straightened first, broad-shouldered, her hair tied back, her face bearing the same stubborn strength Mara remembered in her own mother. The middle child, a year or 2 younger, froze mid-motion, her hands full of dirt. The youngest, little May, though she wasn't so little anymore, peeked out from behind them, wary and uncertain. Mara's breath caught in her throat. "Clara," she whispered. "Ruth, May." The names felt foreign and wholly on her tongue. The girls stared, confusion flickering to shock, to something unreadable. Clara stepped forward first, eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" she asked, her tone sharp, defensive. Mara tried to speak, but her voice cracked under the weight of years. "It's me," she managed. "It's Mama." The word hung there, trembling, disbelieved. The middle girl bit her lip, tears forming but unshed. The youngest May looked down, her hands fidgeting with her apron. The silence between them stretched, painful and raw, until Mara did the only thing her heart remembered how to do. She began to hum. Softly at first, then fuller, warmer the lullaby she had sung on nights when the house was filled with shouting, when her girls huddled under thin blankets, and she tried to make them believe the world was gentler than it seemed. The melody floated through the garden, fragile and haunting. May froze. Her head lifted slowly, eyes wide with recognition, and for a heartbeat no one breathed. Then she ran. Through the rows of flowers, through her sister's startled cries, she ran straight into Mara's arms, the impact knocking the breath from them both. "Mama!" she sobbed, her small hands clutching at her mother's shawl, her voice breaking into pieces of joy and grief all at once. Mara held her tight, burying her face in her daughter's hair, whispering over and over, "I'm here, baby. I'm here." Clara and Ruth watched, tears finally spilling down their cheeks, their hard edges melting under the sound of their mother's voice. Eli stood at a distance, hat in hand, watching the scene unfold with eyes that burned despite himself. He turned slightly, as if to give them privacy, but when Mara looked up at him through her tears, he couldn't hide the shine in his gaze. In that moment, with the sun breaking through the clouds and the sound of that lullaby fading into laughter, the world seemed to right itself, if only for a little while. The woman who had been broken, the children who had been lost, and the man who had forgotten how to feel all of them, somehow, found a piece of themselves again beneath the winter sky. The wind carried the warning first, a low hum across the dry earth that prickled the back of Eli's neck and made the horses snort uneasily. He'd felt that kind of silence before, the kind that falls right before blood gets spilled. The sun was dipping low, painting the world in firelight and long shadows as they loaded their things onto the wagon outside the mission school. The girls were already inside, helping the sisters gather supplies for the road ahead, their laughter light and uncertain, still learning what safety felt like. Mara stood by the fence, one hand resting on the post, her eyes soft as she watched them until she saw Eli stiffen. "What is it?" she asked quietly. He didn't answer right away, his gaze fixed on the ridge beyond the chapel. Then she saw it too, 4 riders cresting the hill, their figures dark against the dying Sunday. At the front rode a man she knew too well. Her breath caught. "No," she whispered. "Not now." Eli's voice was flat, controlled. "Get inside, Mara. Take the girls." She didn't move. "Eli, do it." The tone left no room for question. He stepped out into the open yard, his shadow stretching long across the dirt, and waited as the men rode down toward him. Her husband's sneer was the same as the day he left her bleeding behind the saloon. But there was something hollower in his eyes now, something desperate. "Told you I'd bring the law," he called out, swinging off his horse. "But turns out, I don't need it. Law's just words. A man settles his own debts." Eli didn't flinch. He wasn't armed, not with a rifle. At least, but the way he stood made the weapon unnecessary. "You had your chance to walk away," he said. "You should have taken it." The husband spat in the dirt. "You took what's mine." Eli's voice stayed calm, steady as a held breath. "You gave her up the first time you laid hands on her." The 2 men circled each other slowly. Boots, grinding in the dust, every muscle coiled. Behind the chapel door, Mara clutched the frame. Her daughters pressed close, their small hands gripping her skirt. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't do this." But the words didn't carry far enough to stop what had already begun. The husband lunged first, wild and clumsy, swinging hard. Eli dodged, the blow grazing his shoulder, then drove a fist into the man's gut so hard the sound echoed through the yard. The other 3 drew back, uncertain, watching as their leader stumbled and snarled like an animal. He swung again, and this time Eli caught his wrist, twisting until bone cracked, then shoved him backward into the dirt. You think you can take her from me? The man wheezed, spitting blood. You think you're better? Eli's eyes flashed cold. No, he said. Just not a coward. The fight turned savage after that dust and sweat and the dull thud of flesh against flesh. They traded blows until blood streaked both their faces, until breath came in ragged bursts, until neither could tell where rage ended and survival began. Then, with one last strike, Eli drove him to his knees. His knuckles split and raw. You're done, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Go home or whatever's left of it. The husband staggered to his feet, swaying, his pride bleeding out faster than the cut above his eye. For a moment, he looked like he might reach for the gun at his hip, but the sight of Eli standing firm, fists still clenched and ready, broke what was left of his nerve. He spat once, hoarse and shaking. This ain't over. It is for you, Eli replied. And the man must have known it was true, because he said nothing more, just climbed onto his horse and rode off into the dying light, alone, his men following at a distance. When the sound of hooves finally faded, Eli leaned against the fence, his breath coming hard, the blood from his split lip mingling with dust. Mara ran to him, tears streaking her face, and when she touched his arm, he flinched, then let her hold him. The girls watched from the doorway, wide-eyed but unafraid, seeing for the first time what strength really looked like, not the kind that takes, but the kind that protects. As the sun dipped behind the hills, the world went quiet again, the air thick with the weight of what had been won. Not victory, not revenge, but something deeper, the end of fear. Spring came to the prairie as if the land itself had decided it was done mourning, the brittle brown fields giving way to tender green, the air carrying the sweet smell of new rain and wild sage. The long journey home felt different this time, lighter, alive. The wagon creaked beneath the weight of supplies and laughter, the girls talking in bursts of wonder as they took in the endless sky and the way the sunlight stretched forever. Mara rode beside Eli, her shawl fluttering in the wind, her face turned toward the warmth as if she were soaking up every drop of freedom she'd once thought lost. When they reached the ranch, the place looked almost reborn, though neither of them had lifted a hammer yet. It wasn't the house that had changed, it was the sound. Where silence once lived, there was now movement and song. Girls running through the yard, calling to the horses, chasing chickens with gleeful shrieks. The echo of their laughter bounced off the hills and rolled through the hollows like the ranch itself was breathing again after years of holding its breath. Mara threw open every window, scrubbed every corner, and hung linens to dry in the sun until the wind carried the smell of soap and lilacs instead of loneliness. The girls took to helping with chores as naturally as birds finding sky. Clara strong and serious, Ruth curious and quick, little May darting between them with endless energy. And Eli, once a man of few words and fewer smiles, found himself caught off guard by how quickly they filled the empty spaces in his days. He showed the girls how to saddle horses, how to mend fences, how to tell a storm by the smell of the wind. They listened wide-eyed, calling him Mr. Eli at first, then simply Eli, as though he'd always been part of their world. In the evenings, they gathered by the fire, Mara mending clothes while the girls read from borrowed books, their voices soft against the crackle of the logs. Sometimes, when the night was still and the sky burned with stars, Eli would look around that small room, the light dancing across their faces, the warmth thick enough to feel in his bones, and wonder if this was what peace really looked like. Not quiet, but the absence of emptiness. Not solitude, but belonging. The ranch began to heal along with them. The fences stood straighter, the pastures greener, the house no longer leaning with grief. Even the horses seemed to sense it, nickering softly when he passed, as if they too had waited for laughter to return. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the land in gold, Mara joined him on the porch. The girls were inside, their laughter faint behind the door, and for a long moment they just watched the light fade over the horizon. The wind tugged at her hair, catching in the last rays of daylight. She placed her hand over his, her touch warm and sure. "You saved me," she said softly, her voice threaded with gratitude and something deeper, something like love. "But you gave them their mother back." Eli turned his head slightly, studying her face in the glow of the setting sun day. The lines of hardship were still there, but so was the strength, the quiet beauty that had carried her through every kind of hell. He looked out over the fields, the same land that had once seemed cursed with silence, and felt something loosen in his chest. "Guess we saved each other," he said, and his voice was steadier than it had been in years. She smiled, leaning against him, and they sat like that as the light faded, the world falling into a hush that wasn't empty but full, the kind of quiet that comes after the storm has finally passed. And when Eli Rawson smiled, truly smiled, it wasn't the ghost of what he'd lost, but the truth of what he'd found. A home, a family, and a heart no longer haunted by the past.